Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is a pivotal figure in modern philosophy, merging rationalism and empiricism and shaping much of subsequent philosophical discourse. His critical philosophy, articulated in his three critiques critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and critique of the power of judgment, centers on human autonomy. Kant posits that human understanding formulates the general laws of nature structuring our experiences, and that human reason generates the moral law underpinning beliefs in God, freedom, and immortality. Thus, scientific knowledge, morality, and religious beliefs are interdependent and grounded in human autonomy, the ultimate purpose of nature in Kant's philosophical system. Immanuel Kant, born in Königsberg, was a central figure in modern philosophy. Despite his modest artisan family background, Kant excelled academically, influenced by rationalism and empiricism. He taught at the University of Königsberg, where he developed his critical philosophy, emphasizing human autonomy. Kant's significant works include the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of the Power of Judgment. These works argue that human understanding structures experience and that reason generates moral laws, reconciling scientific knowledge, morality, and religious belief. Kant's ideas laid the groundwork for much of modern philosophy, impacting various fields. The Critique of Pure Reason explores the possibility of metaphysics defined as knowledge pursued by reason independent of experience. Kant aims to determine the possibility, sources, extent, and boundaries of metaphysics based on principles. For Kant, metaphysics involves a priori knowledge, knowledge justified without relying on experience, and he links this type of knowledge to reason. The book's project is to investigate whether, how, and to what extent human reason can achieve a priori knowledge, addressing the core question of the capability and limits of human cognition in metaphysical inquiry. The Critique of Pure Reason was written during the Enlightenment, a period marked by confidence in human reason due to the successes of modern science. Particularly Newton's achievements, this confidence led to questioning traditional authorities, promoting the idea that individuals could determine how to live and what to believe. Kant emphasized the importance of reason and its free public examination of all claims, including those of religion and legislation. However, there were concerns that unchecked reason could lead to negative consequences like materialism, atheism, and skepticism. Kant's critique aimed to address this crisis by showing that reason, when properly critiqued, supports and harmonizes science, morality, and religion, thus affirming the Enlightenment's faith in reason's sovereignty. To understand his project, The Critique of Pure Reason, we must consider his departure from the Platonism of his inaugural dissertation. Initially, he posited a dual world where Newtonian science applied to the sensible world and moral principles to an intelligible world. However, he doubted how a priori knowledge of an independent, intelligible world was possible, realizing such knowledge could only be of the sensible world, structured by the human mind. This Copernican revolution proposed that knowledge depends on the mind's structuring, thus reconciling science with morality by limiting scientific determinism to appearances and preserving moral faith in God and freedom. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he argues that humans experience only appearances, not things in themselves, and that space and time are subjective forms of human intuition, not objective realities. This thesis, called transcendental idealism, posits that if we abstract from human perception, space and time, along with their relations, would disappear. Kant asserts that our intuitions are merely representations shaped by our senses and sensibility, not reflections of the actual nature of things. This view suggests that while space and time are necessary for human perception, empirically real, they do not exist independently of it. Transcendently ideal. Interpretations of Kant's transcendental idealism vary widely, with two main influential interpretations, though significant scholarship does not neatly fit into either camp. The two objects reading. A traditional interpretation of Kant's transcendental idealism distinguishes between appearances, that is, mental representations dependent on human perception, and things in themselves existing, that is, existing independently of perception. This interpretation, dominant during Kant's lifetime, suggests that while we experience only appearance, things in themselves must exist to provide sensory data. Philosophical objections to this interpretation include: 1. Contradiction. Kant claims we cannot know things in themselves, yet asserts their existence and influence on our senses. 2. Skepticism. It implies radical skepticism, suggesting we are trapped within our minds and cut off from reality. 3. Incoherence. How non-spatial, non-temporal things in themselves can affect us causally remains problematic. The two aspects reading of Kant's transcendental idealism, also known as the one-world interpretation, posits that objects have two aspects, one that appears to us and another that does not. This reading suggests that appearances are not separate objects but aspects of the same objects that exist in themselves. There are two main versions of this theory. One, property dualist interpretation. Objects have two sets of properties: relation, relational, spatial and temporal, and intrinsic, non-spatial and non-temporal. This faces similar epistemological issues as the two objects view and implies a contradiction with Kant's denial of space and time as properties of things in themselves. 2. Epistemological interpretation. It distinguishes between the human standpoint, objects viewed through human cognitive conditions, and the standpoint of an intuitive intellect, objects known independently of these conditions. Human beings can only conceive of things in themselves abstractly. This interpretation avoids some objections but may limit Kant's project more than the text warrants, as some passages suggest a metaphysical significance to the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. Transcendental deduction is a central complex argument in Kant's critique of pure reason. It occurs in the analytic of concepts, where Kant addresses a priori concepts or categories that our understanding uses to construct experience, alongside the a priori forms of space and time discussed in the transcendental aesthetic. Kant aims to show that these categories, such as substance and cause, are objectively valid and necessarily apply to all objects of experience. He argues that categories are necessary conditions of experience, meaning that without them experience would be impossible. Thus, they are a priori conditions for the possibility of experience. Kant's strategy involves demonstrating that these categories are essential for self-consciousness or apperception. He asserts that only through these categories can any object of experience be thought, making them indispensable for experience itself. Kant's argument for self-consciousness in the critique of pure reason contrasts with two rejected views. The first view, based on Locke, suggests self-consciousness arises from consistent representation content. Kant rejects this, arguing self-consciousness comes from synthesizing representations regardless of content, leading to a formal conception of self-consciousness. The second rejected view is a realist empiricist perspective that attributes law-governed nature to reality itself. Kant counters this with a formal idealist view. The mind actively constructs the law-governed structure of experience. He argues that self-consciousness requires an a priori capacity to represent the world as law-governed, emphasizing the necessity and universality of this a priori knowledge. Kant's final condition for self-consciousness requires that our understanding works with sensibility to construct a unified, unbounded space-time encompassing all representations. This unification is essential because self-consciousness demands that all representations can be related to a single objective world. Without this, self consciousness would be impossible. Kant argues that space and time, as pure forms of intuition, must be unified by the understanding to form a coherent spatio-temporal whole. Consequently, the categories as a priori rules govern this unified experience, making the understanding the lawgiver of nature, providing necessary lawfulness to all appearances within this framework. Having explored two central aspects of Kant's theoretical philosophy, the critique of pure reason, namely transcendental idealism and the transcendental deduction, we now turn to his practical philosophy in the critique of practical reason. Given the deeply systematic nature of Kant's philosophy, we will start by examining how his theoretical and practical philosophies are interconnected. Kant's philosophy centers on human autonomy, evident in his constructivist view of experience, where our understanding shapes the general laws of nature. Autonomy means self legislation, and for Kant, our understanding provides the formal structure of our experiences, not their content. This idea is supported by the transcendental deduction, which argues that self consciousness requires this constructivist process. Kant's moral philosophy also hinges on autonomy, with the categorical imperative being the fundamental moral law. Derived from reason, theoretical philosophy explains how the world is, based on self consciousness, while practical philosophy dictates how it ought to be, guided by the moral law. Both aspects involve autonomously constructing a world, theoretically through experience and practically through moral action. Transcendental idealism connects these parts with theoretical philosophy, addressing appearances and practical philosophy, justifying beliefs about things in themselves for moral purposes. Kant criticizes German rationalist metaphysics, reframing it as a practical science that justifies moral beliefs about human immortality, freedom, and God's existence. Kant believes that human freedom, justified only by practical philosophy, is crucial for moral appraisal. For an action to be morally wrong, it must have been within the individual's control to act otherwise. Kant rejects compatibilism, which posits that freedom is simply having internal causes for actions. He argues that if actions are determined by past events, they are not free since the past is unchangeable. Transcendental idealism, positing a nominal self outside of time, allows for true freedom, as this self is not subject to natural causality. However, this raises questions about the interaction between nominal and phenomenal selves and their moral responsibility. Kant's position on human freedom is nuanced. He distinguishes between theoretical knowledge and morally justified belief. While we lack theoretical knowledge of our freedom, we are morally justified in believing we are free. Kant asserts that freedom is known a priori, as it is a condition for the moral law, which we do recognize. This moral law proves the practical reality of freedom. Our consciousness of the moral law, the fact of reason, provides the practical basis for believing in our freedom. Kant argues that we have an inherent, undeniable sense of moral accountability, suggesting that ought implies can, meaning if we ought to do something, we must be able to do it. Thus, our obligations lie our freedom. In both the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason, Kant argues that morality and freedom imply each other, a concept known as the reciprocity thesis. To act morally is to exercise freedom, and full freedom is achieved only through moral action. Firstly, Kant explains that all actions are based on principles or maxims, which are subjective rules that guide behavior. These maxims express the goal of an action, whether it's gratifying a desire or achieving a complex goal. Secondly, Kant distinguishes between material principles, which are based on desires, and formal principles, which are independent of desires and align with categorical imperatives. Categorical imperatives are unconditional moral laws that apply universally, unlike hypothetical imperatives that depend on specific desires. Thirdly, acting solely on material principles means letting desires govern actions, which is not true freedom. True autonomy requires acting on formal principles or categorical imperatives, thus governing oneself rationally. Finally, to fully exercise autonomy, one must act on morally permissible maxims because they are morally right, not merely because they satisfy a desire. This means that true moral action is motivated by duty rather than inclination, ensuring that freedom and moral law are intertwined. Thus, Kant concludes that moral law is a law of autonomy, as freedom and unconditional practical law mutually imply each other. This reciprocity ensures that acting morally is the only way to fully exercise one's autonomy. Thank you.